dive in. So welcome everyone, and thank you for being here. We're very excited that you're joining us for American River's summer webinar series on the Bloede Dam removal and restoring Maryland's Patapsco River. This is the first of 4 webinars on the Bloede Dam removal, and today our speakers will dive into navigating the regulatory review. We invite you to be fully present for the next hour. We're here to cover a lot of ground, and I invite you to be fully engaged and with us as we do that. You have permission to close extra tabs, your email, Slack, silence notifications that may be distracting. And as we move through this information, please write out your questions and comments for us and share your thoughts and ideas. A few webinar housekeeping logistics. You all are muted with your cameras off, but you can communicate with us. You can use the chat and QA features. Please use the chat for comments and the Q&A for questions. They should be at the bottom of your screen. If the chat is filled with questions, they can be hard to track down, so let's make sure we use Q&A for that. And everybody, please take a moment to go into the chat and enter your name, organization, and location so that we can see who else is here. Thanks, everybody. With that, I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Jessie Thomas-Blate.
Thanks, Katie, and thank you everyone for joining us today to talk about a deep dive into the Bloede Dam removal project that American Rivers worked on with a ton of other partners on the Patapsco River in Maryland back in the early 2000s. So I'm Jessie Thomas-Blate. I'm a director of river restoration at American Rivers. I work on dam removals throughout the Mid-Atlantic region, including Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and other states. I'm currently the manager of the Patapsco River Restoration Project and was support staff for the Bloede Dam removal back when we completed that project in 2018-2019 timeframe. You'll be hearing from the head project manager in a little bit, Serena McLean, but first we're going to do a little bit of introduction to get you oriented to the site, the project, the dam, and kind of give you a little bit of background that hopefully you can carry with you throughout our webinar series over the course of the month of June. So this photo on this first slide was taken I forgot that I put the transition in there. This photo was not taken a couple of weeks ago. The photo previous, here we go, is a photo that was taken a couple of weeks ago. And this is from the same perspective out on the Patapsco River. This is the result of the project. So from this picture here with the dam in place to the picture with the full restoration a number of years out, we're going to be talking through all of the years of work on various aspects that we went through with all of our partners in order to get to this result. And so hopefully you'll join us throughout our journey. But today we're going to start off giving a little bit of an orientation. So we're talking about the Patapsco River, which is in Maryland. It's in the vicinity of a place called Ellicott City, which is in the suburbs of Baltimore, Maryland. For those of you who aren't familiar with this area at all, the site of the Bloede Dam is in Patapsco Valley State Park, which is the most popular state park in Maryland. They receive more than 2.5 million visitors annually at this state park. People come here for swimming, fishing, paddling, hiking, picnicking, pretty much anything you can think of on the recreational front. A very popular area, especially during the summer. And so a lot of attention is paid in this particular state park to public safety and recreational access. And those factors are going to play into the project, as you'll see as we move forward. So the Patapsco River was at the center of Maryland's Industrial Revolution beginning in the 1770s. This was a popular area for milling and manufacturing operations in the 18th and 19th centuries, and manufacturing concerns along the river generally utilized water power. Also, the nation's first railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio, was constructed along the Patapsco beginning in 1830. The river itself serves a lot of purposes, as many rivers throughout our country do, and certainly along the East Coast. It provides, at this time, was providing hydropower. So there was rail, people were using it for recreation. It's important for just natural processing and fisheries. This river historically supported abundant stocks of river herring, shad, and American eel. And now, at this point in time, it's considered a high priority watershed for the state and federal agencies because it has co-occurrences of multiple priority species for a lot of different groups. It's also a flashy system. The Patapsco really kind of sort of floods quickly during high rain events. And that's led to some major issues with flooding in Ellicott City, which is a city that the river runs through, and the different dams, as part of this project kind of center around. And so this is an important river for people and nature. And in the middle of all of this, you have all of these issues and all of these needs that this river has to address. It's a river that needs intervention to restore its health and function. And so that's why American Rivers decided to start working on this project more than a decade ago. So the project itself actually has a few different pieces. It really started back in 2008 or maybe even before that, when we started talking with the Friends of Patapsco Valley State Park, the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, who owns the property and dams that we're going to be talking about the different structures on the river. And it started really back with the removal of Union Dam in 2009 to 10 and Simpkins Dam in 2010 to 11 that you can see are sort of sandwiched in between other dams along the river. And so those dam removals happened. The results of those projects sort of feed in to this broader story that we're going to be talking about with the Bloede Dam removal. But after those two dams were removed, there was still the Bloede Dam as the farthest downstream dam on the river. So when it comes to benefiting migratory fish populations, there was still really this kind of roadblock in the river for those fish to get upstream. And so we continued to work through towards the removal of the Bloede Dam, which then ultimately happened it was breached in 2018 and the project was completed in 2019. Currently, American Rivers is working with the state to look at possibly removing the Daniels Dam, which is now the farthest downstream dam. But we're doing a feasibility study up there. And so that's to be determined whether that one will actually come out. But we're going to be focusing most of the conversations that we're going to be having over the coming weeks on the Bloede Dam project. So the restoration objectives for this project centered around a few things. One, restoration of ecology and species. So we wanted to reconnect the river corridor from migratory fish, particularly eels and alosines, those shad and river herring species. We wanted to restore aquatic habitat for all of those species that need the river in order to thrive. We wanted to eliminate the impoundment and restore riverine processes, including sediment transport. We'll be digging into sediment issues at this site significantly over the coming weeks, particularly in next week's session. We also wanted to reduce water temperatures and increase dissolved oxygen levels in the impoundment, and we wanted to improve public safety. So these are some statistics about the dam. It was 34 feet high, 220 feet long. The impoundment's about 10 acres. It was built in 1906 as a hydropower dam. Later today, we're going to be hearing about more of the history of the dam itself. So you'll get to kind of hear a lot more about why this structure was important, why people cared about it, and so forth. But there definitely was a big kind of historic issue that came along with this project that we had to address. The dam itself is made of concrete and rebar, and it was a public safety issue for the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. There were at least 10 fatalities at this dam. It might look fun to folks to slide down this dam. Definitely was an attractive nuisance. Not good when you hit the rocks at the bottom or get sucked into the hydraulics at the bottom. So this was really a priority site, not only for ecological restoration, but also to address public safety. It did have a fish ladder. In the bottom left corner of the slide, you can see a little inset picture of the fish ladder. It wasn't always super functional. The Patapsco, being such a flashy river, does move a lot of debris, logs, trees, other materials, cars during storm events. There, in fact, have been cars that have gone over the dam. It moves a lot of stuff. And that stuff caused damage to the fish ladder. It had, to have constant maintenance in order to be able to be functional. And it wasn't super effective at moving the species upstream that we would have liked to have seen upstream. You can see a couple of motor houses that used to be on the top of the dam in that historic picture. Those came off in Tropical Storm Agnes in 1972. And then the fish ladder itself was built in 1992. So that's a little bit about the dam itself. The project had a few major components. The big parts of it were that we had to move some sanitary sewer lines that were running through the dam. And we'll get into a little bit on that more on the day that we talk about engineering and the project. It involved dam removal, removing the dam itself, and then it involved restoring the site. So the dam itself was breached in September of 2018. The full project construction timeline started in 2017 on the sewer line work and moved all the way through 2019 with the site restoration. And we'll be talking more about what went into all of these pieces kind of as we move along. But ultimately, this project has all the things. It has infrastructure conflicts, big sediment volume, the historic site, there were recreational impacts, high public visibility, former hydropower dam, public safety concerns. There was a lot of issues that we're going to be digging into over the next few weeks. And we had to sort of grapple with all of these pieces, but it's also a beautiful river gorge. There's migratory fish here. There's tons of benefits that made it worth us kind of taking all this on and figuring out how do we deal with all of these issues at this site. And we're going to share these things with you, and hopefully you'll join us for our coming sessions where we dig into kind of the nitty-gritty of all things sediment, engineering and construction, biological monitoring and lessons learned. And if you're in the area and want to join us on July 11th for a behind-the-scenes site tour out at the site, hopefully we can share some of our little off-the-record anecdotes behind the scenes on that tour. Before I close out, I just want to thank all of our partners and funders on this project. There are so many folks that were involved with this. This is not a one-man show. We really had a lot of partners from the community. We had great funders. We had great contractors. Everyone came together to make this project happen. So I want to acknowledge all of the myriad of folks that helped us really accomplish what we've been able to out at the Bloede Dam. And now I am going to turn it over to Serena McLean. She was the project manager out at the Bloede Dam Removal Project, and she will be telling us more about diving into sort of how we navigated the regulatory process with this project.
Thanks so much, Jesse. I really appreciate that overview. And thanks to all of you for spending your time with us. Today, I'm going to take you through an overview of the permits and consultations required in Maryland. A scintillating topic for me, hopefully for all of you as well. And then I'm going to focus the remainder of my time on sharing how we navigated that process and wound up with an overall positive regulatory experience. Just bear with me, folks. There's a little bit of a delay when I click the button. This chart provides an overview of the types of permits and consultations you'll need when doing a dam removal project in the state of Maryland. And it starts with filing a joint permit application for the alteration of any floodplain waterway, tidal, non-tidal, or wetland in Maryland. It's one permit application submitted to the Maryland Department of the Environment that results in the Clean Water Act Section 404 permit, your 401 water quality certification, your stormwater management and sediment erosion controls. We initiated permitting and regulatory review for the Bloede Dam Removal Project prior to the availability of Nationwide Permit 53, which is the Lowhead Dam Removal Permit. So it's, it wasn't available at an option at the time. I'm not going to step through any more of this chart. Instead, I just wanted to show it to help illustrate the different consultations and approvals necessary to permit a project in Maryland, again, at the time that Bloede was done. Often the regulatory requirements are written in an attempt to apply to the broadest array of projects, right? It's a sort of a one size fits all approach that was, originally in our history developed to address environmental degradation and the rise of industrialization and urbanization in the late 19th and 20th centuries. And so as a result, many states, and Maryland again at the time included, don't really have like a restoration lens through which to view projects that are put through the regulatory process. In Maryland, this wasn't the first dam removal project we'd sought permits for, and as such, we knew there were several relevant codes that would drive project design, right? For example, in the state of Maryland, they, again, keep in mind, I just want to keep in mind this is at the time of the project, but we knew the state of Maryland didn't allow for working in the wet. You had to divert water. They must be used for all dam removal projects, and those diversions must be designed to pass a 2-year storm event. We also knew that sediment behind the dam needed to be removed. Sediment couldn't be mobilized. And then finally, one of the other kind of bigger things in the code that we knew would drive design was that stream banks must be left stable. There had to be a less than 2% tractive force on those banks when you left a project. We also knew that we wanted the data and science to drive our design with the Patapsco projects. And we wanted the ability to do what was best for the river. So when we first began to consider the removal of Bloede Dam, we knew it would be challenging. So we did 2 early things to set ourselves up for success. One of those you might not have thought of, but it was actually to start with an easier project. Jesse mentioned the removal of the Simpkins Dam that occurred prior to Bloede Dam. We needed a project that could help us demonstrate proof of concept that, dam removal could happen in the Patapsco Valley and it was a needed thing. And Simpkins, was a project that had less sediment. It only had 90,000 cubic yards of sediment compared to the amount I'm going to tell you that the Bloede has before, but 90,000 cubic yards of sediment, and 97% of those materials were coarse sand and gravel in a river system that moves substantial volumes of sediment every year. The other thing we did when we got to Bloede was we knew we'd need to conduct an alternatives analysis. It was 1, required by the state, but 2, we knew it would help us in navigating decision-making with both regulators and the public as we move this project forward. So we conducted an alternatives analysis that looked at 4 different alternatives. It looked at a no-action alternative. It looked at repair of the dam and fish ladder. And then it looked at 2 dam removal alternatives, 1 dam removal with active sediment management and the other dam removal with passive sediment management. Once we got through the alternatives analysis at Bloede, we confirmed what we knew would be 2 of our biggest regulatory hurdles. That is sediment management, what our sediment management strategy is at the site, and then also navigating historic preservation concerns. And I'm going to leave a lot of the historic talk to Chris, but it really is, I will say that, when we took on Bloede, Bloede really was like the only dam I'd worked on to where I felt like, no, this truly is like a unique historic structure, a more unique historic structure. Let's talk about sediment. So we knew from our investigations that the total estimated sediment load impounded behind Bloede was 312,000 cubic yards. A portion of that sediment load that was sand was roughly 225,000 cubic yards, with finer silts and about 87,000 cubic yards. We also understood the important role that Bloede played from a historic perspective, again, in the development of the Patapsco Valley. What I'm going to do now is give you an overview of how we navigated these 2 issues, how we developed a process that allowed us to get develop a sediment management plan that both worked for the river and also worked for the regulatory agencies. And then how we also navigated the historic preservation aspect from a regulatory perspective. The Patapsco River Valley naturally transports huge volumes of sediment each year, regardless of the influence of any river obstructions or impounded sediment. So in addition to the volume of sediment discussed on the previous slide, sediment samples taken from the Bloede impoundment were analyzed for a suite of 23 metals. Results were then sent to MDE's Land Management Agency, and we received a reply in November of 2013 that, there was nothing of concern. Metals within the impoundment were within normal concentrations for the area, and there was no mercury or PCBs detected. The organic analysis itself was deemed, quote unquote, unremarkable. American Rivers, along with our partners, again, Jesse listed a number of them. We took the analysis of any short or long-term impacts seriously when evaluating the most appropriate method for removing Bloede Dam and managing all of that sediment within the impoundment. So in addition to just your standard quantitative and qualitative sediment analysis, another thing we did was convene a sediment management workshop. There were 28 river restoration professionals, geologists, and sediment scientists that we brought together that all came to the consensus that passive sediment management was the appropriate approach for the removal of Bloede Dam. We also conducted sediment modeling to support the assertion that passive sediment release is not likely to have any long-term impacts to the Chesapeake Bay ecosystem. This modeling demonstrated that although there is approximately twice the sand in the Bloede impoundment than was within the Simpkins impoundment, the higher volume of sediment would not result in twice the deposition in downstream areas. One of the models that we did run, and again, I'm going to leave a lot of that technical talk to our folks that are going to give the webinar next week, but I will say that Yan Tao Sui with Stillwater Sciences did run a DREAM sediment transport model, and he stated that because of the relatively small amount of silt to be released following dam removal, the equivalent to roughly 1 day of the suspended sediment load during an 8-year recurrence flow event. So dam removal, again, it was determined it was unlikely to have any significant impact on the Chesapeake Bay ecosystem. The other thing we did, if you noticed on the bottom of the last slide, was develop an adaptive management plan. This was part of our negotiations with the regulatory agencies. Some of the reasons why we thought that our findings supported development of an adaptive management plan was, again, when you compared it to the upstream dam Simpkins impoundment, which again we'd removed earlier. That was our demonstration project. There was a larger amount of sediment stored at the Bloede Dam, so we felt it was worth our time to invest in and recommend an adaptive management plan. Also, the silt's stratigraphic position, like it was in the lowermost portion of the impoundment. Actually, all of the silts were confined to this really small pocket at the base of the dam mostly on one corner. But it also meant that, again, when we were analyzing whether to do an active versus a passive sediment management approach, it would have been really difficult to just remove those sediments. And then finally, we had the history with the Maryland Department of the Environment in that our earlier they had issued a water quality certification without special conditions. And I want to read, and this again, this 401 water quality cert was issued for the Simpkins Dam removal. So again, this is all in building the case for why we thought we'd be able to do something similar with the Bloede Dam removal. But it specifically said that the Water Management Administration is approving this proposal as a demonstration project. As such, this water quality certification does not affect/change WMA's policies regarding sediment removal and stream restoration with respect to dam removal projects. Depending on the outcome of this project, quote unquote, WMA may revisit these policies in their application for future proposed dam removal projects. Without getting into the history of all the monitoring and data collection that we did to get this demonstration permit for the Simpkins Dam, I can say that we were able to, through that removal, demonstrate that everything we'd predicted with the sediment transport model and with the biological and physical monitoring came to pass, that there were no adverse effects, and that what we had conveyed was what happened. Therefore, we were positing that, we also wanted to pursue get a similar 401 water quality certification for our passive sediment management approach at the Bloede dam removal site. For those unfamiliar with adaptive management plans, like it's an dynamic process of basically setting a plan and periodically reviewing it to monitor what's going on at the site. We had management triggers that said, if we had certain exceedances or thresholds in specific areas that caused excessive bank flooding, they were really particular, and I'm not getting into the details of that, but we had triggers that would cause us to go back in and review actions and see if any remediation needed to happen. A key component of the success of the adaptive management plan is that it was coupled with, monitoring plan that had us out in the stream regularly assessing not only the biological conditions and whether or not the fish were passing upstream of the site, but also a physical monitoring plan. And again, you'll hear more about that when we talk about sediment next week. We also set pretty concrete timelines for decision making. If one of the triggers were to be tripped, so to speak, in the adaptive management plan, there was a decision tree and a process to go through which we'd evaluate whether or not that action happened as a result of the dam removal. And then we had courses for how we'd remediate for that. I guess, spoiler alert, long story short, the adaptive management plan was not triggered during the process of removing Bloede Dam. We had no adverse effects to the Patapsco River Valley upstream or downstream of the project. That was a direct result of the project itself. I spent a lot of time talking about how we navigated sediment management and the concerns over excessive amount of sediment at the site and the steps we took to get regulatory approval for that. But again, knowing the history of the dam and concerns amongst both the community and some of the local historic preservation groups, we also knew that spending time and listening to the community around their concerns on how to preserve the history and cultural aspects of the project would be really important. One of the things we did after we navigated the alternatives analysis and we chose a preferred alternative was we convened a citizens advisory group. This was formed to engage community leaders and to allow for the fluid exchange of ideas and other feedback pertaining to the design of the Bloede Dam removal. We were clear with this group that ideas and comments should focus solely on commemorating the historic and cultural aspects of the site, recreational recommendations, and other social issues related to the dam's removal. We were also clear with the group that, all ideas would be taken into consideration by the team. However, final design would be based on obviously what's technically and financially feasible and what best meets the goals of the project. At the end of the design and consultation phase, we did receive permits for the Bloede Dam removal. Here are a brief look at some of the obligations that were included as part of those permits. One, we were required that as impounded sediment was evacuated, we were to document both the transport of that sediment and fate of that sediment throughout the downstream lower reaches of the Patapsco, as well as the response of the biological community documented. We did quite a bit of tree planting as part of the project as well. You noticed the aerial photo that Jesse showed, but because we had to, a huge portion of the project, and we'll talk about this during engineering construction, was actually moving a sanitary sewer line. And so there were a lot of trees removed, and as such, we did a lot of tree planting and subsequently had to monitor for tree survival. We also had to meet the obligations of our MOU under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, and Chris is going to talk a little bit more about that later. And we had to ensure that our adaptive management plan was executed and followed. Finally, in conjunction with, we addressed all of these things through a minimum of 5 years of monitoring that we completed in June of 2024. And thinking about what we learned from this project, and it's something that I've definitely, taken with me, but one is to coordinate early and often with regulators. We initiated conversations with the regulators almost from the outset, certainly when we made it through the alternatives analysis phase. You know, everyone should ask for a pre-application meeting, and don't be afraid to call your regulators with questions. If the process is unclear, ask for someone to explain it. But, really once we entered out of that initial phase, like we kept the regulators fairly updated often, and they should have been prepared for what was coming their way once they received that 60% design application. I'd also recommend knowing, the code. We knew going in that, how projects were traditionally permitted in Maryland. So you have to know what you're up against and what you should be doing in terms of project design. This doesn't mean you can't challenge the code, as we did, and work with your regulators to try something different. Things change and can change, particularly if you've got the data and information to back that up. I will say, takeaways for other folks pursuing projects. I do want to make sure that like the scope of your project investigation, needs to be commensurate with the scale of the project. The Bloede Dam removal was a $20 million project. And so as such, we knew going in that we were willing to invest in a number of different studies in order to get, for example, the 401 water quality certification outcomes that we wanted. We also knew that in taking on the project, that yes, it was about Bloede, yes, it was about the Patapsco River restoration, but we also knew that some of the things we were wanting the state to explore, might have positive ramifications for other dam removal and restoration projects happening in Maryland. We were forcing, in a way, the state to look at projects through that restoration lens, right? We know what your code says. We totally understand why it's there. But here's data and information that says at this particular site and sites like this, maybe we want to consider a different alternative. Maybe it's okay to let coarse grained sand and gravel move throughout these systems. The other thing I, recommend that everybody keep in mind is that all things change, even the regulatory requirement, if you provide the right information. And I think that providing the information is the key, right? Don't expect people to change and like do what you want just because you say it's the right thing. We were able to document and provide examples from other places in the country that showed that this was, that our expectations were reasonable. And then we also put, to be honest, we put money behind it. We had an adaptive management plan and we had funding for monitoring that allowed us to then document the success of those assertions and share those with the regulatory community as well. Thanks so much, Jesse.
Thanks so much, Serena. That was a great overview of the regulatory process here. We're going to continue to sort of dive down that hole a little bit deeper on the Section 106 part of the historical and mitigation aspects of this project with Christopher Marston. He's with the National Park Service Heritage Programs, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about all the historical documentation that the National Park Service did for this project. So I'll turn it over to Christopher. You're on mute, Christopher.
You see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the work we did to document the historic Bloede Dam in 2016. First, thanks again to Serena and Jesse for help shepherding us through the project. We gave them a proposal to do HARE Level 1 documentation, which is measured drawings, history report, and large format photography. All of our documentation goes to the Library of Congress, where it's part of the HABS HARE HALS collection with our sister organizations, Historic American Building Survey, Historic American Engineering Record, and Historic American Landscape Survey. HABS is 90 years old. HARE is now 50 years old. HALS is 25 years old. There's over 40,000 sites documented. And some of it's documented in-house in our office in Washington to document historic sites, some of which are in danger of demolition, others because they're important sites and on their way to being preserved. But we're also part of Section 106 laws, where if the state SHPO or highway department deems a site is regionally or nationally significant, it should be documented to HABs standards. Sometimes this is done by our office or by National Park Service regions, and sometimes this is done by contractors, collection manager, contractors, archaeologists that document it. Sometimes it's just done with photographs and a history, and but level 1 includes measured drawings, which is what we did. Brief background history of the site. It's named for Victor G. Bloede. He had immigrated to New York at age 1 way back in 1850, educated in New York at Cooper Union and a chemist, and had several patents to his name, built his own company, and biggest claim to fame was getting the contract to sell the postage stamp glue used by the U.S. Postal Service for several years. He bought some property in Catonsville, Maryland, outside of Baltimore, developed some of it for housing, but also put his estate on there, and noticed there was a lack of electricity in the late 1800s. So what does he do? He decides to build his own power plant along the Patapsco to generate power. And he used a typical concrete Amberson dam built by Amberson Company in Boston, but uniquely, he decided to put an underwater hydroelectric power plant instead of the typical hydro plant adjacent on one of the abutments. But inside, he put in Samson turbines powered by Leffel water wheels with Alice Chalmers generators. And this worked for several years. Unfortunately, the Baltimore competitor, Consolidated Gas and Electric, was always fighting this development. It was litigation for several years. And Bloede kind of won the war by winning the suit, but lost because he had to sell out to Consolidated by 1913. The power plant only operated for another decade and finally lost out due to financial reasons. There's a lot of sediment backing up and inefficiency of the power. But it is a historic site, and the dam stayed intact until Agnes, where the fish ladder came out. Some of the other structures were demolished. The state invested in repairing the site, adding a new Denil fish ladder in 1992. However, when it was deemed time to be removed, we worked with American Rivers on the mitigation documentation. So how do you document a large, over 200-foot long dam with water running through it? We now use laser scanners. We used to use measuring tape and graph paper when I started 30 years ago. Now we use fancy laser scanners, which can give a very accurate reading and document a site like this in only a couple of days. We did 17 stations with our P50 Leica laser scanning and walked our way through the site with targets that had to line up with each site. And we also use a panoramic camera that also gave high density photographs to help create a large point cloud that could be used and made into a 3D model. Here's part of our talented team, Jeremy and Ryan, out carrying our expensive scanner across the river. as we're setting up for the second day of field work. Here's a view of the P50 like a laser scanner. So it like looks out onto the site. It can do accurate readings up to 100 meters. So that was plenty for the 240-foot long dam site. And then we set up targets along the way that it can connect to, and then connect all the points to create an accurate point cloud. Here's an example of some of the pano photos. So it's basically a 360-degree photograph, which when you print it out, looks like a flattened 3D view. So here's a view from the North Shore looking out on the dam, the fish ladder, and the wastewater pipe that's on the north side. And here's a view from inside the dam, where it's kind of flattening out these doorways in between each bay, and showing the variety of graffiti that's been in there over time. And here's a view of the completed point cloud, 3D point cloud from the 3D model. So it's taking the data along with the high definition range photography to create this very accurate point cloud. And this can be manipulated, sliced and diced to make accurate measured drawings and plan section and elevation, and then also use for animation, which we also did. We also had the unique opportunity on this project when we documented it, did the field work in 2016, and then 2 years later, Serena and Jesse notified us that we could allow you to come out after they've breached it during the demolition, and we did one more day of laser scanning to document the site with no water going over it. So here our crew is setting up the scanner to show it the uncovered or unwatered dam. I'm going to the top of the dam to look down over it, and you can see the Patapsco River all channeled in, going through that area on the south abutment where that has been removed. And here's a view we couldn't get before. This is upstream. So all this area of the dam was underwater. And then you can see these two bays here was where the sluice gates and intakes originally were as part of the power plant. And that is, so you can see evidence of that was all taken out later and closed up. And here's a view of the dam with all the porthole windows. These porthole windows were used to help light the interior of the dam when it was originally a power plant. After we had done the laser scanning field work back in 2016 in the fall, I went out with our newly hired photographer, Jared Ortiz, to do the large format photography. Jared had been hired for a national search for the next Ansel Adams as part of the Park Service. And he was a very good qualified photographer, came down from Milwaukee to join our team. And we did a couple days of photography at the dam. And here's Jared setting up with his waders downstream to get an elevation view. And here's his beautiful large format photograph of the dam. And we did other views as well. Note this crane in the foreground here, doing some fishing at the base of the dam. And we're going to see this guy a few times later because he hung out there for about 4 hours that day while we were doing photographs inside and around the dam. Here we are up on the fish ladder. There's our crane in the middle. Here we are atop the south abutment. There's our crane. And there's his final photograph with the crane in the middle. We also did some interior views of some of the bays. Since it's very dark and muddy inside the dam, Jared brought out his expensive lighting equipment so we could do a lighting setup. So here's the lights and the final product. And then here's one of the bays. This is a bulkhead that was over where the intake was for the original Samson turbine, and the sluice gate and trash rack on the outside. All these interior buttress walls were further enclosed and widened later, so there was more space originally for the equipment. Here's some examples of the drawings. This is the title page showing the dam along the Patapsco River with Simpkins Dam and Union Dam and Daniels Dam upstream. Historical report and information about the project, showing American Rivers as the lead client, along with the partners of Maryland DNR, Maryland Historical Trust, NOAA, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Here is a plan view of the dam site, elevation as it looked in 2016. And there was some historic views of the power plant. So here's one of the bays that I was just showing you with the bulkhead, the intake, the Samson turbine, powered by the Leffel water wheels with the Allis-Chalmers equipment generator. And here's a view which we could create with the help of historic drawing showing the original width of the buttress walls in between the dam, the open space for the power plant, showing that the powerhouse was on the south side of this 100-foot section. And this was the original timber foot fish ladder that was there until it was destroyed by Agnes in 1972. Here's the comparison drawing of a view of what they called it, the machine room back then. And we were able to interpolate that, as well as looking at some extant parts of the dam to insert where the machinery would have been in that drawing. Here's another historic view. There was so much sediment in the original design that they had to put motor houses atop the two bays of the intake bays with a Westinghouse motor in these machine rooms that could help open and close the sluice gates on the rear of the dam. And this shows a day of cleaning on the backside with the motor houses and the sluice gates back here. And we didn't get to see this view until 2018 when they breached this section of the dam. And there's a historic downstream elevation showing the motor houses and the fish ladder. Here's a few cross sections through the dam, and this shows the powerhouse, how it would have looked historically. And again, the trash rack and sluice gate with the intake tube into the Samson turbine and generator with the motor house atop. And this shows the opening. Later on, these walls were closed in more and just an opening big enough, 4x8 opening big enough for a man working the dam to walk through. And using the data from the point cloud, we could create this isometric drawing, highly accurate, and show it how it would look historically with the powerhouse equipment inside the dam, and then how it looks today with the new Denil fish ladder. And then all this documentation has now been transmitted to the Habs Hair House collection at the Library of Congress, prints and photographs room. So this can be found online, and all our documentation is all on the American Rivers website under its Bloede Dam section. And then my colleague Dana Lockett did a fly-through in 2021. And I'd like to show just a minute of that if I can. Sorry about that. I'll share again. But I would like to thank all our partners, and I really appreciate being able to work with American Rivers. I'm just gonna exit. I can't find it. But we can share the animation later in the follow-up email. And it was a great opportunity to work on with American Rivers on this. We've since documented the 2 large dams over the Potomac River for C&O Canal that are over 700 feet long. We also did the mitigation work at the tidal basin, which is now being reconstructed by the Park Service down there in Washington, D.C. So thanks again, and thank American Rivers for allowing me to participate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christopher. It's really cool to revisit all of the work that you all did on that project. It was just a lot of historical documentation, and really neat to kind of dig into that history. At this point, we do have a few minutes for questions. I thought that you can enter them into the question and answer. Serena has answered a bunch of them in there, but one of them I thought, while we see if there's any other questions that I thought might be of interest to more folks, would be Toby Hooper's question about how did you navigate potential resistance or opposition from the public or organizations? Serena, do you want to just sort of share your thoughts on that part?
I'm happy to let you share your thoughts since I added mine to the questions. I can expand on it if you want, but go for it. You're navigating that now even, so go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it just had to do with listening to people. One of the hurdles that we faced at this particular site, being in the middle of a state park, was that there was actually commuter bikers using a trail that goes along the edge of the Bloede Dam impoundment. And we were going to have to close that trail for a while, 18 months or so, I think, in order to move the sewer line, which you'll hear more about when we talk about engineering, and do the dam removal project. And so there were people that were not happy about the fact that they were going to have to change their commuter route. And so we had open houses where we talked to those folks, and we heard their concerns, and we tried to address what we could. We couldn't address all of them. I mean, the project, in order to happen, did have to have that closure, but we also talked with folks about some of the reasoning behind the project and why this was so important, especially from a public safety perspective. And I think that people were receptive to understanding that, people had been dying at this dam, that it wasn't safe for the public to be kind of moving around this structure anymore. And so I think that was part of it, was just really kind of allowing people the space, be able to share their thoughts about it, and then doing what we could to address the things that we could, and otherwise kind of explaining the thinking beyond that. Serena, do you have anything to add beyond that?
I think that's a good summary, and I'll point out what Melanie shared in the chat. I did use Bloede as an example for our community engagement webinar, so we go into a little bit more depth there. I'm curious, this is a housekeeping question that I probably shouldn't ask, but I'm going to anyway. So when we answer questions in the Q&A, can everyone on the webinar see those answers? Okay, thank you.
Yes, everyone should be able to see it. We can also put these in a Word document and follow up if folks are interested, and share these afterwards. Folks who are seeing the recording of this will not actually be able to see Q&A.
All right. I don't see any new questions. Certainly we'll be talking about a lot more aspects of this project in the coming weeks. Katie, did you want to share the slide that you have to just remind folks of what the upcoming webinars are and what their dates are?
Happy to. Give me just a minute.
Our hope with this whole series is that everyone sort of gets to kind of get a flavor of what battling with some of these different issues are at dam removals, and hopefully maybe gives you food for thought if you're dealing with one of these issues at a site that you're working on. So we would love everyone's feedback. We will be having little surveys come up after we close out today, and love to hear more about, you know, your thoughts on this approach. This is really the first time that we're doing like a deep dive, you know, a multi-session kind of webinar series on one of our projects. So we'd love to hear, you know, if folks want to hear more about that kind of stuff. Go ahead, Katie.
Thanks, Jesse. So today was the first of 4 webinars on voting specifically, and today we covered navigating the regulatory review. Next week, we are going to dive into the sediment. So we're calling that sorting the sediment. You can join us for the same time. It might even be the same link for you all, June 11th at 1 p.m. And then our third webinar, Executing the Plan, is diving into coming up with the engineering plans and design and navigating everything with that. And lastly, our Fun with Fish is really the biological monitoring, which is actually ongoing. It's still, I believe, Jesse, right? No, okay, it stopped.
Nope.
But it did go on for a while.
You wrap that up.
So we'll dive into that, and you'll hear all the details on that on June 25th. Then in July, this is not a webinar, this is in person. We're doing a site visit. And if you would like to join us for that, you're more than welcome to. Our registration right now is still through the same registration for the webinars, and then we'll reach out to folks who have registered for that specifically. So we'd love for you to join us for as many of these as you can. We will have the recordings posted, so if you miss one of the dates, I will be sharing it out to everybody, and it'll be up on our website pretty soon. Thank you again to Jesse and Serena and Christopher, our speakers for today, and for all the wonderful information in this deep dive.
Thanks, everybody, and thank you, Katie, for keeping us all on track.
Of course.
Thank you.
We hope to see you next week.